This is section 814. We're going to take a look at the three basic trig ratios. So we're going to examine the three basic trig ratios of a right triangle. Now here's just an example of a right triangle, and just to remember, it has 90 degrees. The two sides next to the 90 degrees, we call those legs. And if I have a corresponding angle, in this case we call this theta. So theta. This corresponding angle, we would say that this is the adjacent leg because it's right next to the angle. We would say that this is the opposite leg because it's literally opposite the angle. And then the hypotenuse is always opposite the 90 degrees. Now, because we have these different sides, we can actually compare them. I could compare the hypotenuse to the opposite, or the hypotenuse to the adjacent to the opposite. We can go through and create 6 different comparings of these two different sides of this right triangle. Now, for today's lesson, though, we're only going to focus on 3. So there's a total of 6. We are going to go over all of these, but just in this lesson, we're going to go over 3. So the first 3 are going to be the opposite to the hypotenuse, the adjacent to the hypotenuse, and the opposite to the adjacent. If I were to just do that from here, that's my angle, the opposite to the hypotenuse in this case is 5 over 13. The adjacent to the hypotenuse is 12 over 13. And then the opposite to the adjacent, that's going to be 5 over 12, opposite to the adjacent. Now these have names. We call this first one sine. We call the adjacent to the hypotenuse cosine, and we call the opposite to the adjacent tangent. Now just note there are 3 more that we're going to talk about a little bit later, but we're just going to focus on those 3. Now to make it a little bit easier, instead of saying sine of theta, we write it like that. This is not sin theta, this is sine of theta. We would say this is cosine of theta. This is tangent of theta. It's good to use the full name of it because it provides better context. This is not sin. This is not cos. This is not tan. Tangent, cosine, sine. Now we need to know these. It's going to be super important for this trigonometry area. We need to learn them immediately. Good thing you've probably already talked about a little bit this in Integrated 2, so hopefully this is mostly review. If you remember that there's a mnemonic that helps it with this, SOHCAHTOA. So, sine is opposite to the hypotenuse. Cosine is adjacent to the hypotenuse. Tangent, or TOA, is tangent is opposite to the adjacent. So, if we're going to find the ratio, we just need to look at the angle that it's talking about. So in this case, talking about theta. And then I just need to know SOHCAHTOA. So SOHCAHTOA. So it's asking for the sine of theta. So the sine of the angle is opposite to the hypotenuse. So opposite 20 to the hypotenuse, 29. So sine of theta is 20 over 29. Now we're not solving for anything, right? That's going to be the next step. We're just finding the ratio. So same thing here, we have cosine. Now, I know that cosine, SOHCAHTOA, so my cosine of P is going to be adjacent over hypotenuse. Well, my adjacent is 15, but I don't have my hypotenuse. It's not there. We need to use the Pythagorean theorem. So if there's ever missing information, you can use the Pythagorean theorem to find the third missing side. So 8 squared plus 15 squared equals c squared. Now if you were to simplify that, you're going to get c equals 17. So then the cosine ratio adjacent to the hypotenuse is going to be 15 over 17. So using SOHCAHTOA, we can find the ratio. Now we can also just enter these values in our calculator if I wanted to find it. Sine of 55 degrees, you can enter that in your calculator, and it'll give you 0.82. And you should try this out. Tangent of 45 will give you 1. Cosine of 60 would actually give you 0.5. And this is a ratio that we're going to talk about later, so don't worry about that just yet. But the cosecant of 30 degrees is going to be 2. So what did we learn today? We talked about the 3 different trig ratios: sine, cosine, and tangent. What's the sine ratio? Our sine ratio is the ratio opposite to the hypotenuse, and it's always going to be sine of an angle. And then what does the SOHCAHTOA, what does that mean? So is the sine ratio, so sine of my angle is opposite to the hypotenuse. Cosine is going to be my cosine ratio, which is adjacent to the hypotenuse. And TOA is my tangent ratio. Tangent theta is opposite to the adjacent. This does conclude our lesson. If you have any other questions, please leave them in the comments.